Joe Budden lets his co-hosts know they are expendable.
I'm letting go of you and Flip already, then that's the big deal to me. Flip leaving.
Who's your 1, 2, and 3?
Without Surf being home.
Who's your 1, 2, and 3?
Impacts thing. We're gonna ship you and Flip out
For Rory.
Prime Rory.
I need Mella-ish.
As much as it's gonna hurt me.
That's right. On the last episode of the Joe Budden podcast, a fascinating discussion was had, and it involved Mal, Rory, the old days, and how the current podcast is doing. During the episode, there was a discussion had about would they trade for Rory. Now, everybody knows Rory was part of the Joe Budden podcast when I believe the show was at its peak. Not only did it have the numbers, it also had the critical acclaim. You couldn't go anywhere without somebody talking about, hey, did you hear Joe Budden with Rory and Mal? It was going crazy. Nowadays, I don't think that's the case. And throughout the debate, they started having a discussion about who they would trade for Rory. And Joe was essentially saying he would trade Flip and Ish and a bunch of other packages. But I think what this turnkeys is into a discussion about the war between Joe Budden and Rory and Mal. Now, Rory and Mal have just signed a deal with the Volume. And I know the Joe Budden podcast is makes way more money than Rory and Mal. They have way more numbers. They're able to drop crazy times and also do crazy Patreon numbers. But as far as the headlines, the value of being on the Volume, Rory and Mal have struck a critical blow to Joe. I mean, Rory and Mal, it was often thought that they started out of spite. They would only last a year and they would break up. But now they have close to 400 episodes and they just have done 3 deals. First, they were on Sirius. Then they were on Studio 71. And now I think they've done their biggest deal in the Volume, where they're even adding a 3rd podcast that's about sports. In totality, Rory and Mal have proved they don't need Joe. Yes, they needed him to get hot, but they maintained the flame. And now I think Joe is being that toxic ex-dude. He's pumping up Rory left and right. He's making it seem like Rory is a god-tier podcaster. And we have to rewind to back in the day at the start of the breakup. Joe Budden blamed Rory for everything. He made him seem like a racist white man after having him on the podcast for years. I mean, maybe not racist, but just some white man opportunist that was trying to usurp the value from the Joe Budden podcast and demeaning his actual inputs. Now, fast forward to today, and I think Joe has been doing some reflection about what's going to take the show to the next level. He's been talking about it on Spaces, and I think he's often thought about how to change the chemistry of the podcast. There's people up there not taking the show as serious as they should be. They are arriving late. They aren't critical thinkers. And some of those folks are Melissa Ford, right? Even though she has had a lot of moments for the show, it's simply because of her existence, not necessarily because of the continuity and the chemistry. It's just because she's famous, she's beautiful, and all of that jazz. And when she makes a ditzy comment, it's going to go viral. Then you have Flip, who, when he first got there, he was a godsend. He turned the show up. Ish and Ice were kind of boring. They hit their ceiling. But ever since then, he's become redundant, both in vocabulary and actions. He doesn't have the range. Then there's Ish, who allegedly hasn't signed his contract and couldn't even wear a blazer for the 10-year anniversary. And there's Ice. We all know what Ice is. He's the friend that Joe Budden can rely on, so he lets him get away with stuff that is not something he would let anyone else get away with. He shows up to work, he shows up on time, and he's respectful, so Joe appreciates that. But now, Joe is dissing the current cast, even if it's in jest. It's still, to me, indicative of how Joe views them. He said Prime Rory. Prime Rory is better than Flip. Prime Rory is better than Melissa Ford. Prime Rory was the glory days. I don't mean to rhyme, but it just was. And it's not even like it's just opinion. You could go online, you could look up Loaded Zay, or I said Loaded Zay, Loaded Clips and Zay, and you could see 2 hours worth of compilations of Rory just going crazy, podcasting out of his mind. The case could be made that in urban podcasting history, Rory's run was incredible, and now he anchors the Rory and Mal show as the A mic. Rory's the A mic. None of the podcasters on the show are A mic. And we also have to talk about Mal, because Mal seemingly responded to Joe Budden trying to make overtures or trying to extend an olive branch by doing laughing emojis when Joe Budden released the episode of him talking about trading for Rory. But let me know what you think, guys. Do you feel as if Joe is trying to divide Rory and Mal, or does he know it's too late? Rory and Mal are out of here. And even if their numbers aren't what the old pod used to be, there's still a couple things they can do to really take things to the next level. Those being get the big interview with someone like Jay-Z or Drake. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying, remember the Joe Budden podcast. It was a steady climb. It wasn't like it was just popping one day. You know, the first big moment was Drake views rant. Then it was Migos and Joe. Remember when he was on Complex? He talked about it on the show, and it did a million views. Great episode. Then it was Pusha T, right? The interview where he talked about dissing Drake, story of Adidon. It's a slow climb, and you never know what Rory and Mal might have up their sleeve. They might interview somebody big. Jay-Z might wake up one day and say, I want to do an interview with Rory and Mal. Like I said, I don't know if it's going to happen. I doubt it's going to happen. But the fact that there is a trick to play means that they're in a vantage point. And right now, another discussion I want to talk about is about 7 months ago, Joe was talking about how, you know, he's making calls, he's looking at deals, he's trying to see what's happening, and no deal has come. This was around the time where all the podcasters were signing massive deals in the current era. Granted, they were white podcasters like Travis Kelce and Call Her Daddy, Conan O'Brien. But that deal has not come for Joe. And for all of the independent talk that Joe Budden does, I do think he wants to sign a big, groundbreaking deal. That will be the culmination of all his years of hard work. And that deal hasn't materialized. Independence is fun. Independence is also stressful. So, once again, I felt like I had to touch upon this subject because it was interesting, it was fascinating, and a discussion about where Joe currently views his current co-hosts in regards to his old co-hosts, which I feel were the glory days of the Joe Budden podcast. But listeners, I wanted to end this video by asking, who do you think was the best matchup? Would you do Joe, Rory, and Ish? Would you do Joe, Mal, and Ice? Do you feel like the best podcast was simply Joe, Rory, and Mal, and that's it? There's some people who think Joe, Ish, and Ice were the best interpretation of what a great podcast was for the JBP. Follow me on Instagram to Stop TV. Follow me on Twitter to Stop TV. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.